I'd wanted to build this project for quite some time, this 1:700 688i poking up through the ice, but I didn't exactly know how to do it, so I just set it aside. But I think I've got it all figured out now, although the thumbnail says otherwise, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But for right now, we are going to start out with some black to undercoat this, and then we will apply some MRP Fine Surface Primer Oxide Red. The black undercoat is just to get better mottling on the kind of split hull. This line here is basically where the red oxide primer will live, and then above that line will be black. So with this all black base, it is time to mottle the fine surface primer and then apply the blend coat. Just a standard mottling process here, nothing too crazy. I didn't want to go overboard for this because I didn't know how much of this would show through, and really this 1:700th build is practice for another build in 1:350th, but here's what the mottling looks like after it's been done, and then this is how it looks after a blend coat. But with the red all done, it is time to mask it off and paint the black again. I always work from light to dark. Well, most of the time I work from light to dark. I just find it easier to put the colors down that way. And I'm just using some masking tape here to mask off the red. It's about here. Like I said, this is basically just practice, and I have no idea how much of this is going to be seen anyway. So I'm just kind of having fun with this build, quite frankly. With the red all masked, I am going to reapply a black base coat to cover all that red up and start again with a uniform base. And then I'm going to do my mottling this time with dark gull gray, just because the color that will be the blend coat is going to be black over top of black. So this will just give some visual interest to the otherwise fairly monotone upper hull. And with everything painted, the masking tape can come off, and then it's time to apply the handful of decals that are supplied with the kit. Just a small little sheet of decals for this tiny ship. Nothing too crazy here. I think this is probably the fastest I have ever put on decals because there's about 6 of them. And for this, I'm just going to do my standard decaling process, which is first applying some micro set, getting the decal exactly where I want it, and then I'll usually take a Q-tip to remove the excess micro set or any water on the surface once I'm happy with how it's placed. And then I'll go through and apply some micro sol to melt the decal into the surface, and then I'll apply a layer of clear coat. But for right now, I am just going to shut up and let you guys enjoy the process of putting the decals on this 688i. I'll see you in a few moments when it's time for weathering, and then we'll talk about how this build went horribly wrong. With the matte clear coat applied, it is time to start the weathering, and for this I've gone through my drawer and just grabbed a handful of Ambo by Meg's oil brushes that I think are going to be the right color to recreate the weathering effects I need, which I'm going after something that looks like this, so I've just grabbed various colors that I think I can mix together, and then usually once I've got all those colors, I'll kind of be a little bit more selective in thinking about what layers I'm going to apply. Here I'm looking at what I want to mix with black, either Starship Filth or Starship Bay Sludge, and I'm going to end up picking Starship Filth. I like working with the oil brushers out of a well, and then I use this silicone clay shaping tool to just mix the oil colors together, and then I can wipe the tool off and I don't have to worry about dirtying a brush. I'm going to apply this first layer of weathering with a sponge, and this first layer of weathering is really just going to accentuate the mottling that we did earlier on the black upper part of the hull. I just want to use the oils to add some more tonal variation, and I'm just going to take the sponge, load it with oil, and then check it on my thumbnail and make sure I'm happy with the pattern. There's not too much oil in the sponge. If there is, I'll just dab the sponge on a paper towel, but I'm going to dab the sponge all over the model, go back to the well, get more paint if I need to, and then we'll stipple it in here in just a few moments. Then, using a brush ever so slightly damp with white spirits, I'm going to blend that oil into the surface of the model. The white spirits will help the oil flow a little bit and also remove some of the excess. Basically just adding another layer of tonal variation with oils instead of an undercoat pre-shade. This is sort of like a post-shade, but I'm doing it with oils instead of my airbrush, and this is how it looks. I repeat this process all the way down the hull, and then I will leave it overnight to fully dry. It's a very thin layer, so you don't need to worry about it still being wet after a day or so. For the actual layer of grime, I feel like a mix of Starship Bay Sludge and Dust would work well. I actually added some medium gray in here too, just to kind of tone it down from brown and give it a little bit more of a gray hue like the reference images. Again, I'm just mixing this in my well to get the color I want, and then I'm going to apply this color in the same manner as we did earlier by using the sponge and just dabbing it into the surface, but the blending here will be a little different. It's going to be more controlled using a number 1 brush and less white spirits. I like working in small sections when I'm doing this technique. You don't have to work in small sections, but I find that doing it in small sections is more helpful just because you get to work a little bit, do a little bit, and you get to kind of take a step back and see if you're happy with the area before applying it to the rest of the model. That way you're kind of more so in control of the effect and you don't have to worry about going overboard. And when I do this effect, I do like to take the less is more approach, so I'll apply less than I think I need and go through the technique, and if I decide that I want more in the end, I'll just apply another layer. It's much easier to build this up in multiple layers than to take a layer off, because usually when you take a layer off, you take the subsequent layers underneath, especially if it is still fresh. So small sections is advantageous. Using a number 1 round brush damp with white spirits, I'm going to stipple the oil together to blend the oils together as well as into the surface. This is a lot tighter and a lot more precise than using a flat brush that I was using earlier in the process of post-shading the upper hull, but this gives me more control. And the goal here is to create a filter or a kind of uniform layer of grime that still has that random variation of the sponge in it. And then after I looked at some reference images, I decided I wasn't happy. I didn't think the layer was comparable in thickness. It wasn't as opaque as the real thing. So I went back and I applied more. And then I'm just going to clean the edge of this up using a 5-0 brush, damp with white spirits. This brush is going to be a little bit more wet than it would be during the blending process, but this is just to make sure I get any excess oil that is above the water line off of the hull. And then I'm just going to rinse and repeat this, and this is how it turned out. So I figured I was going to make the ice by taking some of this 2-part resin epoxy, mixing it together, adding the ever so slightest touch of white paint just to tint it, and then I was going to pour it out on a wax sheet and break it up into small pieces. I did this a little bit before everything went haywire, which we are rapidly approaching. But this seemed to be successful, and I've kept all this resin for when I reattempt this process. But the idea here was to basically get little chunks of ice, like the images of the boat actually poking up through the ice, and then I was going to apply that over the actual block of resin that the boat was going to be encased in, and then add the snow on top of that. And I think this technique worked pretty well. The wax paper prevented the resin from sticking, and it all laid out in a nice, fairly thin sheet. And I think this is how I'm going to make ice going forward. But this didn't work out for this project, and we'll get to that in a second. So I had actually never worked with 2-part resin before, so this project was a giant practice project for 2-part resin, and I learned a lot of things. You can see I'm making an absolutely gigantic mistake here. I'm using an entire bottle at once. This is part 1, and then I'm going to add part 2 here. It is not meant to be used this much. I thought this would be a deep pour resin. It is most definitely not, and we'll see that in just a second. The other mistake I made was I added way too much paint here. I'm very happy with the color for Arctic Water. This dark sea blue from AK Interactive is a very nice color. I made a form. I went ahead and poured this into the form, and I said, okay, now we are going to encapsulate the entire boat. So I mixed up a whole nother glass of epoxy, and that's kind of where it went wrong. It would have been okay. It definitely wouldn't have gotten as hot as it did if I hadn't poured the entire thing. And if I just left it here, it would have been totally fine. I could have come back and poured another section. But I was worried that there would have been a very visible demarcation between the two sections. It actually wasn't even touching the boat at this point. I just went with a 2-inch thick section just to have it be a nice display. But here I am making my fatal, very fatal mistake here, mixing up the final section of resin. Definitely learned my mistake on this one, and I'm happy it's with something that didn't really take me too long to do and had been kind of sitting on my shelf of doom for a while. I definitely want to reattempt this, but as a warning to all of you out there, and I'm sure many of you watching this already know, and you're probably laughing at me, I'm laughing at me watching this in hindsight, way too much resin. But yeah, so I got it all poured, I got the angle of the boat set, and then the resin started curing. And it got really hot. was using a torch to get all the air bubbles out, and I actually thought I was heating the resin up a little bit, or maybe I had caught the rubber on one of my clamps on fire or something, because it started smoking. And that's kind of when I realized, hey, this isn't the boat's sinking. And the stern of the boat was actually melting under, and you'll see here in just a second, this is what ended up happening. So you can see where the stern of the boat completely started melting. I yoinked the boat out as quick as I could, but it was already too late. And then the block of resin was actually so hot, I poured it under some water, and it turned that water into steam very quickly. But I got it cool. I drilled a bunch of holes in it just so I could break it apart. And the stern actually got bent pretty good, and it burned a hole in the side of the boat. But I broke the resin apart just so I could get some more water in there and cool this thing off, because I was worried about it catching fire. But this was all in the name of practice, and I'm okay with that. I learned a lot, and I hope you guys did too. Or if you already knew, you're looking at me like, oh, this guy's a friggin' idiot. Hey, we learned. But it's alright, because it was all practice for this, a 1 to 350th scale 688i vertical replenishment diorama, basically like this scene on the box. Thank you for watching. That's all for this project. I'll definitely be doing this again, so make sure you follow, that way you don't miss out on the redo of this 1 to 700th scale ICEX diorama, or the upcoming 1 to 350th scale 688i vert wrap.